So I'm going to take a look at the AS Paper 1, that's the micro paper, section A from 2016. So this is the short answer questions where you get some multiple choice questions and then some questions that may be worth 2 or 3 marks. And it's all the 3 mark questions can be quite difficult because you have to answer them in a certain way. So we will take a look at that. So on the right hand side is the mark scheme and the left hand side are the questions. So question 1, which one of the following is the most likely consequence of an increase in the division of labour in the production of smartphones? So the key term there is division of labour. So division of labour is where you split the production process into lots of different sections and each person's doing one little bit. So if you're on a production line, you'll have each person doing a separate part of the job and they just spend all day doing that job. Division of labour could be in a school where you've got teachers doing their own subjects. You've got teachers specialising in one subject or 2 subjects. You've got the accountants, you've got the kitchen staff, etc. So that would be another way that division of labour happens. But in this sense, it's looking at production of smartphones. So that's most likely to be on a production line. Now, the key thing about division of labour is that if a person is doing the same thing all day, they're going to get quicker at it. So if we have a look at the options that we've got, a decrease in boredom. Well, if you do the same thing all day, that's actually going to lead to an increase in boredom, especially if it's working on a production line. A decrease in the use of specialised manufacturing equipment. Well, you still need to use the specialised equipment. A decrease in the cost per unit of smartphones. Now, if people are doing the same thing all day, they're going to get quicker at it. So that means they're going to produce more per day, which is going to decrease the cost per unit. And then D, increasing training workers' costs. Well, no, it's actually going to be a decrease because you've only got to train your worker to do one job. You've not got to train them to do the whole lot. So that's why D is incorrect. Part B, this one is actually quite difficult. Looking at it on the surface, it looks a straightforward question, but in order to get the marks, it is quite difficult. So what we'll do is we'll look at the different aspects of the question and look at what the terms mean, and then look at how to answer the question. So the first thing is about the functions of money. So functions of money are things like money is a medium of exchange, it's a store of value, a standard of deferred payment, etc. Specialisation is a bit like what we've talked about in the previous question. Specialisation is where workers specialise, they focus on doing one thing and they get better at doing that one thing. And I think an important part of this question is we're already specialising, but we're specialising more, we're improving the specialisation. So you have to make sure you address the fact that not just that we're specialising, but that we're improving the specialisation. So the specialisation aspect is getting better than it was before. So, with a question like that, if you're not really sure what to do, just throw anything at it. So define all of those things and then at least you're going to get something. But if you want to try and answer the question properly, I think the best thing actually is to look at the mark scheme and see how they're approaching it. So these 3 mark questions are split into 3 parts. You've got knowledge, which is like your key terms. So if you defined everything, then you're bound to get at least 1 mark, right? So knowledge and understanding says 1 mark for definition of specialisation, or definition of money acting as a medium of exchange, or a measure of value, or a store of value, or method of deferred payment. So if you look at the chapter on money, you've got functions of money, you've got characteristics of money. Those things that they've mentioned there in the mark scheme are functions of money. Specialisation requires exchange. Now the thing about this is it's all very well countries specialising, but if India specialises in tea, Kenya specialises in bananas, then it's only any good if they're going to trade with one another or with third-party countries, because India doesn't just want tea, Kenya doesn't just want bananas. You need to exchange or you need to trade. So any of those things, you'll get you 1 mark. If you said more than one thing, you're still only going to get 1 mark. So you're going to get a maximum of 1 mark. But if you're not really sure how to approach a question like this, at least start off by putting down some key terms. The second mark is for what we call application. So that's where you're going to be talking about smartphones, because that's what's referred to in the question. So you need to refer to smartphones and how this is relevant to smartphones. So they've given you an example here. It says 1 mark for application to a process, business or worker. It's not really very clear. An example is going to make it clearer. So e.g., a worker lives by exchanging earnings for making smartphones. So what he's doing is he's getting money for doing his job. That's where the function of money comes in, because the function of money is paying him for his work. So he works by exchanging earnings for making so his earnings from making his smartphones, he then uses that to buy goods and services. So that's the function of money. He's being paid in money, and he uses that money to purchase whatever he chooses to purchase. And the analysis bit at the end, it says 1 mark for link development from money to improved specialisation. So remember, we've talked about money now, we talked about specialisation at the beginning in our knowledge, but we need to mention the improved specialisation. And this is the bit that most people are likely to miss out, because that improved word is kind of, the specialisation seems to be more important and the improved gets missed out. So what they're suggesting is that new technology enables further specialisation. So what they're saying is the business benefits from specialisation, and because they're making more profit through specialising, they can then buy more machinery in order to specialise further, or they could train their workers better so that the workers can be more productive. So I think that is a very difficult question. It's probably one of the worst ones I've seen, in terms of it looks sort of like it could be straightforward. There's no difficult concepts in there, but linking it all together is difficult. Right, next one, define the term external benefits. So sometimes it's easier to start off by talking about an example. So when we think about benefits, we might think about benefits from being vaccinated against COVID. The external benefits are going to be the benefits to the third party. So if I'm vaccinated against COVID, well, we don't really know the evidence at the moment yet, but if I'm vaccinated against COVID, I'm less likely to pass COVID on to you. So you benefit from that. So if we look at the mark scheme, they're giving you all sorts of things. So you could say benefits to the third party. Now, you can't just say third party, you need to say benefits to the third party. So you can say benefits to the third party. Some textbooks talk about spillover effects. So that means effects to the other people. So it's I benefit and that benefit spills over to other people. Positive externality, again, is something that you might have thought of writing about. But there's lots of different things that you could get the mark for, but I think most likely would be benefits to the third party. Right, the next one is one of these slightly confusing diagrams, and this is quite a difficult question. So let's talk about what it's showing first of all. So which one of the following measures could a government introduce to achieve the social optimum consumption of a nursery school place? So education, we know, is something that has positive externalities. So we're wanting to increase the consumption of that. So the first thing we need to look at is where we are in the free market. So if we had no government intervention and we were left to our own devices, where would we consume? And in order to find that out, we need to look at the private benefits and the private costs. So where do private benefits equal private costs? And that is where we would choose to consume, because we only take into account the benefits and costs to ourselves. So the crossing point is point T. That means we are going to choose to consume at this point here, which is quite small, QE. So that is where we would choose to consume. The socially optimal point is where we take into account the benefits or the costs to the third party. So that's where we look at the social costs, and the social benefits. There's social benefit, social cost. The crossing point is R, which means the optimal or the ideal is Q1. So ideally, we want to be consuming at Q1. So what we need to do is we need a policy to get consumers at Q1. Doesn't matter what the price is, but we need to get consumers to consume Q1. So you can either do that by shifting the demand curve or by shifting the supply curve. So we could do something to shift demand to the right or something to shift supply to the right. Now, unfortunately, none of those answers shift the demand curve to the right, so we can't do that. So it's going to have to be something that shifts supply to the right. So what we're looking at is shifting supply to the right so that the equilibrium is Q1, which means we're going to have to go through there. So that needs to be our new supply curve. So if this is our original supply curve, this is our new supply curve, so that this is our equilibrium, and then we're going to be producing at Q1. So in order to get the supply curve to shift to the right, if we look at those things there, then we're going to be wanting to have a subsidy. Now let's just check. The size of the subsidy is going to be RS. That is the size of the subsidy, the difference between the two curves. So B is your correct answer. Now I've already made quite a mess of this diagram, but we need the diagram for part C. So part C says annotate on diagram A the welfare gain. So the welfare gain, in fact what I'm going to do is I'm going to rub off all of these bits now because we've got in a bit of a mess. So the welfare gain is always that little triangle. So you need to shade the triangle, and that's your welfare gain. That's the first part. You have to be careful with these questions because there's actually two parts they want you to do. And the new socially optimal. We talked about that in the previous question. The socially optimal is the ideal. And if you remember back from the previous question, we said the ideal was Q1. So make sure you label those when you draw them. So you'd label that as your welfare gain, and this is your socially optimal, sometimes called optimal allocation of resources, or I sometimes refer to it as the ideal, but socially optimal is the official term. So you've got quite a lot going on with that diagram. Right, question 3. The area around Lake Naivasha in Kenya supplies 70% of the UK cut rose flower market. Much of the water which the flower farms are dependent on is extracted from the lake. This has resulted in damage to the fish stocks and increasing competition for water. So what's happening here is you've got a lake, the flowers need the lake, or the flowers need the water from the lake, and the fish need the water from the lake. If you take water from the lake for the flowers, the fish have less. So the question is saying the impact of the flower industry on workers in the fishing industry. So what that means is the fishing industry are suffering because they've not got as much water. So that tells you it's going to be a cost. So that's narrowed it down. Now, the impact of the flower industry on the fishing industry, well, that's going to be an external cost because the fishing industry is external to the people making the decision, i.e. the flower industry. So that's going to be an external cost. It's quite confusing because it's difficult to know which one they're referring to, but because the flower industry is the one making the choice, they're the ones taking the water from the lake, then it's the people that are suffering are external to that. So that's why it's C. Explain one measure the Kenyan government could use to reduce the impact of water extraction from Lake Naivasha. So they need to step in and stop the flower companies taking so much water. So there's lots of things that they could do, and then you've got to explain as well. So maybe they could put regulation in place, they could limit how much water they take, they could maybe tax them. And you have to think about which one of those is going to be the easiest to explain. So let's look at the mark scheme for the way that they have allocated it. So the previous 3 marker was three different skills. It was knowledge, application and analysis. This one is 1 mark for knowledge, 2 marks for application. So the knowledge mark would be for identifying, so it says tax on water or regulation, subsidies to water efficiency or substitute water provision to lake, and permits, a bit like you learned about pollution permits. So you give your thing and then you have to explain it, but you need to apply it to the lake. So you don't just want to say tax the water and then talk about tax without referring back to the lake. So here it said, it's giving you an example, increased taxes would make it more expensive to take the water from the lake. That's going to reduce the profits and it's therefore going to reduce consumption of water from the lake. You could use a diagram showing supplies shifting and quantity falling. So you could say, you could draw your diagram, supply shifts to the left due to the tax, and the quantity is going to fall from Q1 to Q2. Obviously put labels on your diagram as well. So that's another thing that you could do instead of explaining it. Question 4. So a restaurant in London offers an all-you-can-eat buffet for £8.99. At this price, you can refill your plate as many times as you like. With reference to the statement above, explain what is meant by diminishing marginal utility. So this is a topic that does come up occasionally, but it's often something that you study at the start of the course and then it gets forgotten. So it's a strange concept, but utility is the benefit that you get from consuming something. So you go up to the buffet. Well, let's think about it as pizza, because you get one slice at a time. So you go up to the buffet, you take one slice of pizza, and that slice of pizza, you really enjoy it. It's your first slice. And we have to put a value on the enjoyment that we get, which is a bit subjective. But let's suppose the first slice of pizza is really nice. We're going to get 10 units of enjoyment from it. Doesn't matter what those units are. So we're going to rank that as I've enjoyed it, that as 10. The next slice, because you're not quite as hungry and you've already had one slice, you're going to enjoy it, but you're not going to enjoy it as much as you enjoyed your first slice. And so on. And it's not necessarily going to move down in the same direction, but you're going to get to a point where you've actually had too much and then you feel sick and you're getting absolutely no enjoyment. You're getting displeasure from that last slice because actually it's really, you just feel really ill. And that's where you've got negative utility. So that's what's happening with marginal utility, with utility. Marginal utility is, well, this is the we go from 8, so the utility for the first slice is 10, the utility for the second slice is 8, so overall you've had total utility of 18, but the 8 is the marginal, it's the utility from one more, 6 is the marginal, etc. Diminishing marginal utility means that each time it's going down. So going down from 10 to 8 to 6, that's diminishing marginal utility. So that's a little bit about the concept. Now explaining it in terms of answering the question. With reference to the statement above, explain what is meant by diminishing marginal utility. So let's have a look at how they want you to answer that. So again, that's another 1 for knowledge and 2 for application. So 1 mark for diminishing marginal utility, e.g. as decline in the additional satisfaction a person derives from consuming, and a decline, I think that means a decline in the additional satisfaction a person derives from consuming an additional unit of that product. Now you could do it in terms of numbers, but we have 1 more unit or we have 1 more plate of food. The first plate's really nice, the second plate you don't get as much utility from. 2 marks for linked application. So this is the premise on which all-you-can-eat buffet operates, as they know each additional plate of food provides less utility than the one before. Don't think that's a particularly good explanation. I think most people will eat only until their marginal utility matches the price that they paid, or people eat until they're satisfied, but do they? Have you ever been to one of these buffets and come out feeling sick? I know I have. Otherwise, if you kept eating, you would reach the point of being sick or dissatisfied disutility. These two things are just examples of what you could write. You can say, when I was explaining it, I talked about you feel sick. I personally would probably write about it using some numbers, because I think it's easier to explain using numbers. So I would explain that so I talk about the first plate or the first slice, you're getting 10 units of utility, the second slice 8, so you've got diminishing marginal utility, and that you get to a point where you actually feel worse than by having it, and that's where you've got disutility or negative marginal utility. So I probably explain it using those numbers. And then we've got another one related to the buffet. If the buffet falls in price, well, that's one not to get confused by. That's just a very straightforward demand curve. The buffet falls in price, then we're going to move along the demand curve a lot where the arrow is, and that's known as an extension in demand. And then we've got a calculation question. So since peaking at £1.32 a litre in July 2014, petrol prices have fallen by 20%. Well, that's nice because they've given you the percentage already. You've not got to work the percentage out. What is the expected percentage change in the quantity of petrol demanded if the price elasticity of demand is minus 0.2? So we need to start off with our formula. Percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in price. So they've given you the PED as minus 0.2, and they have given you the percentage change in price. So the price needs to go on the bottom. Now, before you go any further, it's worth looking at, some people get confused by the negative signs. You might want to kind of just forget about the negative signs so that it doesn't make things look too difficult. But if the price has fallen, then you know the demand is going to increase. So you can rule out anything with a negative sign before you even go any further. Now, the two answers that you've got to choose from are both quite similar, and that's sort of saying to me, well, probably one of them is if you get your zeros the wrong way around, or you lose a zero in your calculation. So be careful not to lose a zero in your calculation. So our correct answer is on the top. We'll call that quantity demanded. So in order to find out the percentage change in quantity demanded, we need to do minus 0.2 times by 20%. So minus 0.2 times by 20%, well, we've got a zero there. We can cross the zero off and move that decimal point along. So then you're left with 2 times by 2, which is 4%. Right, the next question is another 3-marker. It says the price elasticity demand for petrol is minus 0.2. Explain the change in the total revenue of petrol stations as a result of cutting their prices. Now, I like to talk about total revenue in terms of diagrams. So first of all, total revenue is your price times by your quantity. If the PED is inelastic, that means that the demand curve is very steep. Now I'm going to exaggerate it just so that then it shows us what we're trying to do. So we're cutting the prices. So our total revenue, remember, is price times quantity. It is the area. So if we go P1, Q1, it is P1 times by Q1, or we could call it this area in green. If we cut our prices, what you can see is price has fallen to P2, quantity is increased, but quantity is only increased by a very small amount. The total revenue is now the area under the pink. So what's happened is you've lost this green bit at the top, let's call it area A, but you've gained this tiny little pink bit, call it C. A is bigger than C, so overall total revenue is going to fall. So what's happening here is price has fallen by a much bigger percentage than quantity demand has increased. So you drop your price, you get extra customers, but you don't get enough extra customers to compensate you for your extra reduction in price. So therefore it's not a really very good idea if the firm has inelastic demand to reduce the price. So let's look at how they want you to answer this. So again, it's a knowledge and an application. So 1 mark for identity that the price fall would result in a fall in total revenue, or definition of total revenue. Well, I've done both of those, so I've more than done enough for those 2 marks. 2 marks for linked application. The percentage rise in quantity demanded is lower than the percentage fall in price, as demand is price inelastic, or less than 1. So I didn't write that down, but I did say that because PED is minus 0.2, demand is inelastic, and I've drawn the inelastic demand curve. But if you look at point 2, it says diagram showing inelastic demand. So even if you just drew an inelastic demand curve, you're going to get a mark, because what you've done is you've taken the 0.2 and you've translated that to the inelastic demand curve. And then you've got some marks for showing the areas and how total revenue is going to fall if you reduce the price when demand is inelastic. So that's the end of section A, which is worth 20 marks out of the paper. Section B, you have passages to read, charts to look at, and then you've got your questions to answer, just like you have in the macro paper. So you get 5, 10, 6, 4 and 15, and then you get a choice of 2 essays.